Every cow standing in the field today descends from an animal that no longer exists anywhere on Earth, and for most of scientific history, nobody could actually prove that connection directly. Scientists compared cattle DNA against every wild, cattle-like bovine still walking the planet today: bison, gaur, banteng, and water buffalo, checking each one as a possible living relative, and found none of them were a real match. The actual ancestor had already been gone for centuries by the time anyone thought to look, and confirming the connection meant doing something far harder than simply comparing a farm animal to a living wild relative, the way researchers could with almost any other domesticated species. It meant reading the genome of an animal already extinct. That animal was the Aurochs, and in life it looked nothing like a modern dairy cow standing placidly in a pasture. Bulls stood up to 180 centimeters at the shoulder, carrying horns that could stretch 80 centimeters from base to tip, making them among the largest and most physically imposing land animals anywhere in Europe at the time. Aurochs once ranged across Eurasia and North Africa, appearing in prehistoric cave paintings, described in Roman military accounts as fearsome game animals nearly the size of elephants, and hunted for their size, power, and meat for thousands of years across that entire range. That hunting, combined with steady habitat loss as farmland expanded across the continent, gradually shrank their range century after century until only a small, isolated population survived in the forests of Poland. The last known Aurochs, a female, died in the Jaktorow forest in 1627. Unlike the wild ancestors of dogs, goats, pigs, and horses, all of which still exist somewhere in the world today in some living form, the Aurochs left no living population behind at all, meaning there was no wild bovine anywhere left for scientists to simply test cattle DNA against directly the way they could with almost any other domesticated animal. Researchers had to work with fragments instead, piecing the picture together slowly across more than a decade of incremental studies. In 2001, the first meaningful genetic survey of cattle that included any Aurochs material managed to recover only a few hundred nucleotides of mitochondrial DNA from preserved remains, barely enough to establish that a family connection existed at all, let alone answer any detailed questions about how close that connection actually was. A stronger result came in 2010, when a separate team recovered a complete mitochondrial genome from a Mesolithic wild Aurochs specimen, confirming the maternal line link between Aurochs and domestic cattle far more solidly than the scattered fragments recovered 9 years earlier had been able to manage. But mitochondrial DNA, passed down exclusively through the maternal line, only ever tells half of any animal's genetic story. The much larger, far more informative nuclear genome, the genetic material actually responsible for the bulk of an animal's physical traits and biology, remained completely unread for another 5 years after that. If you find this interesting, be sure to subscribe to understand more DNA from the past. That changed in 2015 when a team led by geneticist David McHugh at University College Dublin sequenced the first complete nuclear genome ever recovered from an Aurochs, using a bone roughly 6,750 years old, found inside a cave in Derbyshire, England. The team extracted more than 470 million individual DNA reads from the specimen, spanning over 16 gigabases of genetic material at an average sequencing depth of just over 6 times coverage, then compared that genome directly against 81 modern cattle genomes, and genetic marker data pulled from over 1,200 additional animals spanning a wide range of breeds and regions. The analysis identified more than 5 million individual genetic differences, separating the ancient Aurochs from the modern cattle reference genome. A detailed enough picture to finally settle exactly where the Aurochs sat on the family tree, relative to every other candidate species researchers had ever proposed as a possible wild ancestor. The result delivered the direct comparison nobody had been able to make before. The Aurochs sat clearly and unambiguously as the ancestral outgroup to domestic cattle, confirming the species had been domesticated primarily from wild Aurochs populations in the Near East. The true match researchers had spent over a decade trying to properly document distinct from bison, water buffalo, or any other large bovine that might have looked like a plausible ancestor from the outside but shared nowhere near this level of genetic connection. That confirmation came with a complication nobody had specifically gone looking for. When the team compared their British Aurochs specimen against cattle breeds from different parts of Europe, one detail stood out immediately. Traditional British and Irish cattle, breeds like the Scottish Highland and the Irish Kerry, shared noticeably more genetic material with this particular British Aurochs than cattle breeds from anywhere else on the continent did. A pattern that showed up consistently across the genome rather than in just a handful of scattered regions. That pattern only makes sense if wild Aurochs bulls native to Britain kept breeding with domestic cattle herds after those herds had already arrived from the Near East fully domesticated, adding a fresh, localized layer of wild ancestry on top of the original domestication event that had happened somewhere else entirely, thousands of years and thousands of miles removed. Researchers now suspect early farmers in Britain may have deliberately allowed or even encouraged that crossbreeding, restocking their herds with wild genetics rather than keeping the two populations strictly apart the way the simplest domestication story assumes. The domestication of cattle, in other words, wasn't one clean event that happened once in the Near East and then simply spread outward unchanged. It kept happening in smaller local pulses for thousands of years afterward, leaving a different genetic fingerprint behind depending on where in Europe a particular breed's ancestors happened to graze. Subscribe to not miss the next one. Knowing exactly what the Aurochs genome looked like didn't just settle an old scientific question about ancestry. It gave modern conservationists a genuine blueprint to work from for the first time. The first attempt to recreate the Aurochs predates any of this DNA evidence by nearly a century. In the 1920s and 30s, German zoologist brothers Heinz and Lutz Heck independently began selectively crossbreeding existing cattle breeds, working entirely from old paintings, surviving skeletal remains, and written historical descriptions with no genetic data of any kind available to guide their choices. The result, now known as Heck cattle, resembled the Aurochs in general size and coloring at a glance, but never actually matched the original animal very closely, differing noticeably in build, leg length, and horn shape. Once researchers had real skeletal and genetic comparisons available to check the breed against decades later. Critics within the conservation and rewilding community have since pointed out that several other, less famous cattle breeds actually resemble the true Aurochs, based on the genetic evidence, considerably more closely than Heck cattle ever managed to, despite Heck cattle remaining the more widely recognized attempt of the two. A more recent effort, the Tauros program, launched in the Netherlands in 2008 and beginning actual breeding the following year, takes a fundamentally different and far more rigorous approach. Rather than guessing from centuries-old paintings the way the Heck brothers had to, the project selected cattle breeds directly based on how closely their DNA already resembled the sequenced Aurochs genome, screening more than 30 candidate breeds from across Europe down to a handful carrying the strongest genetic signal, then selectively breeding those specific animals across multiple countries, including Spain, Portugal, Croatia, and the Netherlands itself, in an effort to produce a bovine as close to the genetic original as modern science currently allows. The goal isn't a museum curiosity kept behind a fence for tourists. It's a functioning wild grazing animal capable of returning to European landscapes and filling the exact ecological role the Aurochs left empty when the species disappeared nearly 400 years ago. Line up everything the Aurochs genome actually revealed, and the story goes well beyond simply proving cattle came from a wild ancestor. It confirmed that ancestor by comparing cattle against every plausible wild bovine relative that still exists on the planet today, and found the real match had already been extinct for centuries, buried in a cave in Derbyshire, waiting patiently to be read. It exposed a second, localized wave of interbreeding in Britain that the original, simpler domestication story never accounted for, one that left a permanent, traceable fingerprint inside specific cattle breeds still grazing there today. And it handed modern conservationists something the Heck brothers never had access to nearly a century earlier when they made their own attempt: an actual genetic map for rebuilding an animal gone since 1627, one specific gene at a time, using the exact blueprint hiding inside every ordinary cow already grazing in a field somewhere right now. An animal most people walk past without a second thought, carrying the direct genetic legacy of one of the largest wild creatures ever to roam Europe.